When I was 12 years old, my parents drove me 90 miles into the Nevada desert and ordered me out of the truck. My father rolled down his window just enough to look me in the eye and tell me to grow up and figure it out myself. Then the tires kicked up gravel and they drove away, leaving me standing under the flickering lights of an isolated gas station. I curled up behind a grease-stained dumpster that night, counting the headlights of passing trucks to stay awake. I cut my parents out of my life the next morning. I had not heard their voices in 17 years. Then yesterday, a thick, ivory envelope arrived in my mailbox in Reno. I am 29 years old now, working as a forensic accountant. I spend my days tracking missing assets and finding where desperate people hide their money. I like numbers because numbers do not lie. My family, however, operates on a different currency. To Thomas and Barbara Allen, optics are everything, and the truth is just an inconvenience you pave over. I opened the envelope at my kitchen counter. Inside was a heavy cream card with gold foil lettering. It was a wedding invitation. My older brother Ryan was getting married at a luxury resort in Las Vegas. I traced the expensive embossing with my thumb. Ryan had not spoken to me since the night I was abandoned. But it was not the invitation that made my chest tighten. Tucked neatly behind the return envelope was a scrap of lined notebook paper. It held 3 words written in my mother's unmistakable slanted cursive. "We forgive you." I stared at that scrap of paper until the letters blurred. A pardon. They were offering me a pardon instead of an apology. The sheer audacity of it filled my kitchen like smoke. The people who drove away and left a 12-year-old girl freezing in the desert were granting me forgiveness. What I discovered about the real reason behind that invitation, and what I did when my father raised his glass to toast the room, is the reason I am sitting here telling you this today. Welcome back to Grape Vengeance, where we share quiet, true-to-life stories about family secrets, boundaries, and the exact moment someone finally stops shrinking to fit into a family that never wanted them. Let me know your age in the comments below if you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace. And be sure to subscribe because you will not want to miss how this ends. I set the notebook paper down next to my coffee mug. The anger did not make me shake. It made me incredibly calm. My parents clearly believed my 17 years of silence meant I had submitted. They thought I would quietly accept their narrative and slide back into the family picture just in time to look good for my brother's wealthy new-in-laws. I picked up my pen and checked the line on the RSVP card that said attending. I was not going to this wedding to heal. I was going to conduct a full audit of my family's perfect history, and I was going to burn their fake narrative to the ground. Let me take you back to the night they left me in the dust. 17 years ago, the Nevada summer was punishing. We were sitting in a high-end steakhouse just off the Las Vegas Strip, surrounded by the clinking of heavy silver on porcelain plates and the low hum of expensive conversations. My brother Ryan was 16 and the undisputed golden child of our rural hometown. He had just pitched a perfect game at the regional baseball tournament, securing his status as a local legend. My parents, Thomas and Barbara, treated Ryan less like a son and more like a winning lottery ticket. They fed off the social currency his athletic talent provided. That evening they were basking in the glow of other people's admiration. I was 12 years old, wearing a clearance rack dress, sitting at the far end of the long table, pushing cold French fries around my plate, while the adults ignored my existence. The table was packed with wealthy local sponsors and important figures from our county. Right across from my father sat Mr. Sterling, the owner of the largest car dealership in our valley and the head of the church finance committee. My father desperately wanted to belong to that upper tier of society. He wore a crisp golf shirt he had put on a high-interest credit card just for this trip. He laughed loudly at every single thing Mr. Sterling said, trying too hard to mirror the posture of a man who belonged in a steakhouse that charged $50 for a piece of meat. The conversation eventually shifted toward the upcoming church renovations. Mr. Sterling leaned forward, resting his elbows on the pristine white tablecloth, and looked directly at my father. He asked why the Allen family had not yet submitted their pledge for the new church roof fund. He framed it as a gentle joke, but the social pressure was unmistakable. My father forced a wide, easy smile, attempting to project the image of a successful businessman who simply forgot to write the check. He waved his hand dismissively and told Mr. Sterling that his funds were just tied up in some temporary investments, and the church would receive a generous donation by the end of the month. I did not understand the intricate dance of adult pride. I only understood mathematics and household facts. I had spent the entire week listening to my parents scream at each other behind closed doors about late notices and empty checking accounts. I swallowed my bite of food and spoke up in a clear, innocent voice. I told Mr. Sterling that my dad could not give money to the church because he just spent our entire savings account on a brand new red pickup truck. I added that my mom had been crying because the mortgage check bounced on Tuesday and the bank called our landline 3 times. The reaction was immediate and devastating. The entire table went dead silent. The clatter of forks stopped mid-air. Mr. Sterling raised his eyebrows and cleared his throat, taking a slow sip of his ice water. My father's face drained of all color before flushing a deep, ugly shade of purple. His jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched visibly under his skin. My mother reached under the tablecloth and dug her fingernails into my thigh, forcing a breathless, high-pitched giggle. She told the table I had a wild imagination and read too many fiction books. But the damage was done. The wealthy elite of our town saw right through the facade. My father had been exposed as a fraud trying to play a rich man's game with empty pockets. We left the restaurant 10 minutes later. My parents did not say a single word as we marched across the sweltering asphalt of the parking lot. Thomas unlocked his prized possession. The shiny red pickup truck that I had just announced was bankrupting our family. Ryan slid into the back seat, keeping his head down and his eyes glued to the floor mats. I climbed in next to him. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing us inside a rolling cage of anger. The ride home was an hour and a half of agonizing silence. My father gripped the leather steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned bone white. He drove far above the speed limit, passing slower cars in the dark, with reckless jerks of the wheel. The air conditioning was blasting, but the cab of the truck felt suffocating. The quiet was thick and heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I watched the barren desert landscape blur past my window. The shadows of Joshua trees stretched across the sand, looking like twisted hands reaching toward the highway. I knew I was going to be punished when we got home, but I expected a standard grounding or shouting match. I did not expect what was actually coming. 90 miles from our driveway, the highway grew desolate. There were no houses and no streetlights. There was nothing but miles of sagebrush and cracked earth. Up ahead, the flickering fluorescent lights of an isolated gas station cut through the darkness. It was a crumbling concrete building with 2 ancient fuel pumps and a rusted dumpster sitting off to the side near a patch of dead weeds. Moths buzzed erratically around the glowing yellow bulbs on the canopy. Thomas yanked the steering wheel hard, pulling the truck off the smooth pavement and onto the gravel lot. He bypassed the fuel pumps entirely and stopped the vehicle near the edge of the shadows, far away from the illuminated store windows. He did not put the truck in park. He kept his foot firmly on the brake pedal. He turned his head slightly, looking at me through the rearview mirror. His voice was flat and terrifyingly calm. He told me to open the door and get out to stretch my legs. I hesitated. The desert night was pitch black outside those small rings of light, and the wind was howling against the glass. My mother stared straight ahead at the dashboard, refusing to turn her head or look at me. Ryan sat frozen beside me, clutching his baseball jacket against his chest, his eyes wide with silent fear. I unbuckled my seatbelt and pushed the heavy metal door open. My boots hit the rough gravel. The cold night air bit through my thin clearance rack dress, causing goosebumps to erupt on my arms. I turned around, intending to stretch my back and climb right back into my seat. Before my fingers could touch the door handle, Thomas leaned over the center console. He stared at me with eyes devoid of any parental warmth or hesitation. He looked at me the way you look at a stray dog that just ruined your carpet. He told me that if I wanted to act like a smart adult and run my mouth about household finances in front of the whole town, I could grow up and figure out how to get home myself. Before my 12-year-old brain could process the meaning of his sentence, his hand shifted the gear lever. He slammed his heavy boot on the gas pedal. The thick tires spun wildly, spitting dirt and sharp rocks against my bare legs. The door jerked forward, slamming shut on its own momentum. The red truck peeled out onto the empty highway, leaving 2 dark tracks in the dust. I stood frozen on the uneven ground, watching the glowing red taillights fade into the black horizon until they disappeared entirely. The roar of the engine was swallowed by the wind, leaving me standing alone in the desolate silence. For the first 10 minutes, I did not move a single muscle. I stood on the gravel shoulder, expecting those red taillights to appear over the crest of the hill. Fathers get angry. Adults speed off to make a point. They always come back. That is what my 12-year-old brain chanted, while the desert wind began to strip the heat from my skin. Nevada daytime temperatures bake the earth, but the night steals it all back. The chill crept up through the thin soles of my shoes. My arms erupted in goosebumps. I hugged my bare shoulders, shivering as the reality of the empty asphalt settled over me. A few feet away near the tire tracks, a dark lump rested in the dirt. I walked over and crouched down. It was thick navy blue fabric. My fingers brushed the stitched varsity letters. It was my brother's baseball jacket. In those chaotic seconds before the door slammed shut, Ryan must have hurled it out onto the ground. He could not stop our father, but he surrendered his only layer of warmth. I shook the dust off the heavy wool and pulled it over my shoulders. It hung down to my knees, smelling like laundry detergent and sweat. It felt like a small shield against the immense, terrifying dark. I turned my attention to the gas station building. The main store was entirely dark inside, secured with heavy metal gates pulled across the glass doors. But mounted to the exterior brick wall, under a humming yellow bug light, was a silver payphone. The thick metal cord swayed slightly in the breeze. I walked toward it, feeling the crunch of rocks under my boots. I checked my pockets. I had nothing, no coins, no cash, no identification, just a lint-covered peppermint wrapper. The metal coin slot gleamed under the bulb, mocking my empty hands. I picked up the heavy plastic receiver and pressed it against my ear. A steady tone greeted me. My hands shook as I pressed the 0 button. A woman answered, asking for my emergency or billing information. I told her I needed to make a collect call. My voice cracked, sounding small and fragile. I recited my home landline number. It was the only sequence of digits I knew by heart. The operator asked for my name. I whispered Donna. She told me to hold the line. I listened to the hollow ringing echoing across the miles of telephone wire separating me from my house. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. My chest tightened with desperate hope. Someone was going to pick up. They were probably walking through the front door right now. My mother would answer, and she would be frantic. A loud click interrupted the 4th ring. A man cleared his throat. It was Thomas. The operator spoke in a flat, professional tone, stating she had a collect call from a party named Donna and asked if he would accept the charges. I held my breath, gripping the phone cord so tight my fingernails dug into my palms. I pressed the receiver hard against my cheek, wanting to hear him say yes, wanting him to tell the operator he was already on his way back to get me. There was a heavy pause on the other end. I could hear the faint sound of the television playing in the background at my house. He was sitting in his recliner. He was safe indoors. His voice cut through the static, cold and firm. "No," he said. "She needs to learn her lesson tonight." The line clicked. Then the flat, dead hum of the dial tone filled my ear. I did not drop the phone. I stood there staring at the brick wall, listening to that empty mechanical noise for a long time. It sounded like a heart monitor flatlining. The operator did not come back. The connection was terminated. My own father had just denied a phone call from his daughter, who was stranded in the middle of a wasteland. He chose to leave me outside in the freezing temperature to protect his fragile ego. I imagined him setting the phone down, picking up the remote control, and sipping a cold drink. I pictured my mother taking off her makeup in the warm bathroom, pretending she did not hear the telephone ring. They were settling in for a comfortable night of sleep under thick blankets. They were choosing comfort while their child was exposed to the elements. Something inside my chest fractured and then hardened like cooling glass. The tears that had been stinging the corners of my eyes dried up instantly. I hung the receiver back on the hook. I stopped looking down the highway. I stopped waiting for the red truck to return. The terrified little girl who wanted her parents evaporated under that yellow bug light. A new instinct took over: survival. The open parking lot was too dangerous. The occasional passing vehicle could easily spot a child standing alone under the canopy. I needed a place to hide. I walked around the side of the concrete building, stepping carefully over broken glass and discarded soda cans. Near the back alley, I found a giant green metal dumpster. It smelled strongly of rotting food and motor oil, but the space between the brick wall and the heavy steel bin offered a narrow blind spot. It blocked the biting wind. Propped against the side of the dumpster was a large, broken-down cardboard box. I dragged it into the narrow gap. I flattened the thick brown paper to separate my body from the freezing concrete. I sat down, pulling my knees tight against my chest. I zipped my brother's oversized jacket all the way up to my chin, burying my nose in the collar to block out the garbage smell. I leaned my head against the cold brick. The highway was mostly empty, but every 20 minutes or so, the low rumble of a semi-truck would shake the ground. I turned my face toward the road, watching the intense high beams slice through the darkness. 1 truck, 2 trucks, 3 trucks. I started counting them. I focused all my mental energy on the numbers. 180 tires, 210 tires. The math kept my brain occupied, preventing the panic from swallowing me whole. The cold sank deep into my bones, causing my teeth to chatter uncontrollably. My stomach ached with hunger, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the clarity taking shape in my mind. Family was supposed to be a sanctuary. My family was a business transaction. I had cost my father his social standing, so he discarded me. He balanced his ledger by dumping his daughter behind a trash bin. I sat in the dark and audited my entire childhood. I remembered all the times Barbara praised me only when my grades made her look like a successful mother. I recalled how Thomas only showed affection when other church members were watching. Their love was conditional, based entirely on performance and obedience. The moment I became a liability, they terminated the contract. The desert wind whipped around the corners of the building, rattling the metal lid of the dumpster. A stray dog howled somewhere far off in the distance, sending a fresh wave of adrenaline through my veins. I pulled the cardboard higher around my shoulders, creating a makeshift fortress. I refused to close my eyes. I refused to let my guard down. I was the only person in the world looking out for Donna Allen. I survived that agonizing night by transforming my fear into a quiet, burning resolve. I promised myself I would never rely on anyone else again. I would never allow another human being to dictate my worth. By the time the sky began to turn a faint, bruised purple in the east, I had made a silent vow. I was going to build a life so untouchable they could never hurt me again. But I had no idea that a few hours later, an enormous lie would be set into motion, forcing me into a corner I could not escape. The sky shifted from bruised purple to a pale, dusty gray. Morning broke over the desert, revealing the endless, flat expanse of dry scrub brush and cracked asphalt. My muscles were cramped and stiff from sitting on the flattened cardboard all night. I heard the crunch of tires pulling onto the gravel lot. A weathered beige sedan parked near the front doors of the store. A woman stepped out, wearing a red uniform shirt and a plastic name tag. She carried a ring of keys and a thermos. She walked toward the side of the building, carrying a small plastic bag of trash. As she rounded the corner, she froze. She dropped the bag and rushed over to the gap behind the metal bin. Her name was Betty, and her face was lined with years of working the early shift. She gasped and knelt down on the dirty concrete. She reached out and touched my shoulder, asking what a little girl was doing out in the cold. I tried to answer, but my throat was raw. My lips were chapped and trembling. Betty did not wait for an explanation. She gently pulled me to my feet. She guided me out from behind the dumpster and led me inside the store. The bell above the door chimed loudly. The inside smelled like stale coffee beans and floor wax. Betty locked the door behind us and turned on the space heater behind the register. She sat me down on a plastic milk crate and handed me a styrofoam cup filled with hot chocolate. The heat from the cup burned my numb fingers, but I held on to it tightly. Betty picked up the landline phone mounted on the wall. She dialed 911 and spoke to the emergency dispatcher. She reported that she had found a stranded miner at the station. She kept her eyes on me the entire time, her expression full of pity and concern. I took a small sip of the hot liquid. It warmed my chest, but it did not melt the heavy block of ice that had formed in my stomach. 20 minutes later, a Nevada Highway Patrol cruiser pulled into the lot. The red and blue lights flashed brightly against the store windows. An officer with a thick mustache and heavy boots walked inside. He crouched down to my eye level and spoke in a gentle, measured voice. He asked for my name and my home address. I gave him the information quietly. He wrote everything down in a small leather notebook. He told Betty he was taking me to the local precinct substation a few miles down the road. The ride in the back of the police cruiser felt surreal. The heavy cage separating the front and back seats made me feel like a prisoner. The heater blasted warm air over my freezing legs. I watched the desert landscape roll by through the smudged window. A tiny spark of hope ignited in my chest. The authorities were involved now. The police would call my house and demand answers. My parents would have to explain why they drove away. They would face the consequences of leaving a child in danger. I believed the uniform meant justice. I was about to learn a brutal lesson about how the real world operates. The substation was a small cinder-block building with harsh overhead lighting. The air inside felt sterile. A female youth officer gave me a juice box and a heavy wool blanket. She sat me in a vinyl chair near the front desk. She told me they had reached my father on the telephone, and he was on his way. I sat there, gripping the juice box, waiting for the reckoning. I wanted to see the police place handcuffs on the man who had abandoned me. An hour later, the heavy glass doors of the precinct swung open. Thomas and Barbara walked into the lobby. They did not look like abusive parents. They looked like the perfect, respectable American couple. Thomas wore a clean, ironed button-down shirt. Barbara had her hair neatly brushed and her makeup applied flawlessly. But their faces were twisted into masks of sheer, exhausted panic. Barbara let out a loud, theatrical sob the moment she saw me. She rushed across the linoleum floor and threw her arms around my neck. Her expensive perfume invaded my nose, making me nauseous. She squeezed me tight, pressing my face against her shoulder. She wailed about how terrified they had been. I did not hug her back. I sat rigid, staring blankly at the wall. Thomas walked straight to the desk sergeant and extended his hand. He introduced himself with the firm, polite tone of a successful businessman. He knew exactly how to speak to law enforcement. He projected authority mixed with the right amount of vulnerability. The sergeant asked what happened. Thomas shook his head, running a hand through his hair, like a man pushed to his breaking point. He delivered a fabricated story so smooth it sounded rehearsed. He told the officer we had stopped at the gas station to use the restrooms during our drive back from Las Vegas. He claimed I was going through a rebellious teenage phase and had been acting out for months. He said they turned their backs for 1 minute and I vanished. He looked the sergeant in the eye and swore they had spent the entire night driving up and down the desolate dirt roads, searching the desert frantically. The lie was breathtaking. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. Thomas painted himself as the victim of a troubled runaway daughter. He weaponized his neat clothes, his firm handshake, and his calm demeanor. I pushed my mother away and stood up from the vinyl chair. My voice shook, but I tried to speak clearly. I looked at the sergeant and told him my father was lying. I said he told me to get out of the truck and then he drove away. Barbara gasped, placing a hand over her heart. She looked at the female youth officer with tear-filled eyes. She said I had been making up wild stories lately to get attention. She claimed I was hanging around a bad crowd at school and trying to punish them for grounding me. She reached out and gripped my upper arm, squeezing the muscle hard enough to bruise. Her nails dug into my skin through the fabric of the oversized baseball jacket. The sergeant looked at me and then looked at my father. I watched the silent communication pass between the two men. It was an understanding. The officer saw a well-dressed taxpayer dealing with a difficult teenager. He did not see a victim. He saw a nuisance. The sergeant offered Thomas a sympathetic nod. He told my father that kids pull crazy stunts these days and advised him to keep a closer eye on me. He handed Thomas a clipboard with release paperwork. I stood there in the harsh fluorescent light and felt the last remaining piece of my childhood shatter. The truth did not matter. The facts were irrelevant. The police, the system, the entire adult world operated on optics. Because my parents owned a nice house and spoke with authority, their lies became the official record. My raw trauma was dismissed as a childish tantrum. I realized in that exact moment that fighting them with words was useless. Screaming would only make me look crazy, validating their story. If I threw a fit, they would win. So I closed my mouth. I locked the truth away behind a heavy steel door in my mind. I went entirely silent. I did not speak another word to the officers. I did not speak to my mother when she dragged me out to the parking lot. I climbed into the back seat of the red pickup truck and stared out the window. My parents thought my silence meant they had broken my spirit. They believed they had successfully covered up their crime and secured their reputation. They thought they were taking me home to resume my role as the quiet, obedient background character in their perfect family play. But they were driving me straight toward the one man who saw through every single one of their lies. They were about to face an obstacle they could not charm or manipulate. The drive back to our house felt like a funeral procession. The heavy silence inside the cab was only broken by the hum of the tires against the asphalt. We pulled into the driveway, and I walked straight to my bedroom. I closed the door and sat on the edge of my mattress. My parents thought they had won. They thought their performance at the precinct secured their future. But the next morning, a plain white sedan parked at our curb. A woman carrying a thick clipboard walked up to the front porch. She was an investigator from the State Family Services Department. The desk sergeant at the police station had filed a mandatory report, despite buying my father's fabricated story. The state required a routine follow-up on any minor found wandering near a desolate highway. Panic consumed my parents. A formal government inquiry meant neighbors talking. It meant social workers interviewing my teachers and asking questions at the church. Their pristine local reputation was on the verge of collapsing. Thomas paced the living room floor, chewing his thumbnail. He realized he needed powerful legal intervention to shut the investigation down before it went public. He picked up the telephone and dialed a number he had avoided for 5 long years. He called his own father. Grandpa Harrison was a third-generation cattle rancher who lived on 300 acres of rugged land near the state line. He wore faded denim and boots scuffed from decades of hard physical labor. He had a face carved by the sun and a mind sharper than barbed wire. Harrison despised country club politics. He viewed his son as a weak man, overly obsessed with appearances and social climbing. Within 2 hours, a heavy diesel truck rattled into our driveway. Harrison stepped out. He did not knock. He pushed the front door open and walked directly into the living room. Thomas immediately launched into his rehearsed runaway narrative. He paced around the coffee table, waving his hands, talking about how difficult I had become. Harrison stood perfectly still. He did not interrupt. He just let his son spin the web of lies. I stood, hidden in the hallway shadow, listening to the exchange. When Thomas finally ran out of breath, my grandfather spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. He told Thomas to shut his mouth. Harrison stated clearly that he knew exactly what kind of man he raised. He knew Thomas lacked the backbone to search a desert in the middle of the night. Then, my grandfather laid his cards on the table. He reached into the inner pocket of his canvas jacket and pulled out a folded piece of heavy paper. He tossed it onto the glass coffee table. I peeked around the corner. It was a property deed. Thomas owned a mid-sized logistics company in town, but he did not own the land underneath his warehouse. Harrison owned the commercial lot. The lease was held on a month-to-month handshake agreement from years ago. My grandfather offered a terrifyingly simple transaction. He told my parents they would drive to the county courthouse that afternoon and sign over full, permanent legal guardianship of me. If they agreed, Harrison promised to make the state investigation disappear using his own expensive attorneys. If they refused, he would evict the logistics company by Friday morning and let the social workers tear their lives apart. The choice was between saving their daughter or saving their income. The decision took less than 10 seconds. Barbara looked at Thomas and nodded her head. My father reached for a pen sitting on the end table. He asked what time they needed to be at the courthouse. They traded me for a piece of commercial real estate. They bartered their own flesh and blood to protect a metal warehouse and their standing in the community. I walked back into my bedroom and grabbed a duffel bag. I packed my clothes, my school books, and my brother's heavy wool jacket. I did not shed a single tear. I carried my bag to the front porch and climbed into the passenger seat of the diesel truck. I did not look back at the house when we drove away. The ranch became my fortress. Harrison did not offer warm hugs or bake chocolate chip cookies. He provided something far more valuable. He provided consistency. He treated me like a capable human being. The rules were clear. I woke up early, fed the livestock, and completed my homework. In the evenings, we sat at the large oak dining table. Instead of playing board games, Harrison opened his heavy leather accounting ledgers. He taught me how to read balance sheets and track expenditures. He showed me how to trace a dollar from a bank account to a physical asset. He pointed a calloused finger at a column of numbers and delivered the lesson that would define my entire career. He told me that people will tell you whatever you want to hear, but the math always reveals the truth. Numbers do not lie, but desperate people always do. I absorbed his lessons like a dry sponge. Mathematics became my coping mechanism. When the trauma of the highway tried to creep into my mind, I focused on spreadsheets. I learned to detach my emotions and view human behavior as a series of calculated risks and debts. This intense focus guided me straight through high school and college. I earned my degree in forensic accounting, mastering the art of finding hidden assets and unraveling financial fraud. I turned my childhood betrayal into a highly specialized weapon. When I was 25 years old, Harrison passed away quietly in his sleep. I stood by his grave in the rural cemetery, feeling a profound sense of loss, but also an unshakable sense of strength. He left me the ranch, the property deeds, and a massive iron safe filled with decades of private family financial records. I sold the cattle operation but kept the land. I built a quiet, successful life in Reno, managing corporate audits by day and enjoying my impenetrable solitude by night. I had everything I needed. I answered to no one. My emotional boundaries were built out of reinforced steel. That brings us to the present day. I am 29, sitting at my kitchen counter staring at the gold foil wedding invitation. The sudden arrival of the envelope disrupted my quiet existence, but it was not the only intrusion. Just as I picked up a pen to check the attendance box, my cell phone vibrated against the granite countertop. The caller identification displayed a Las Vegas area code. I pressed the accept button and held the device to my ear. A male voice spoke my name. It was Ryan. My older brother was calling me for the first time in 17 years. He sounded frantic, speaking rapidly about his upcoming marriage to the Preston family. He told me the Prestons were real estate billionaires, and the wedding was going to be the social event of the decade. But his nervousness quickly morphed into something toxic. He started reciting the exact same fabricated history our parents had invented in that police precinct. He told me it was time for me to stop acting like a runaway and finally apologize for breaking our mother's heart. He was demanding I return home and beg for the forgiveness they offered on that scrap of notebook paper. My brother was attempting to rewrite my reality. He wanted me to play the role of the troubled sister seeking redemption just so his wedding pictures would look perfect for his wealthy new in-laws. I gripped the edge of the counter, realizing my long silence had only given them the space to pave over my history. Taking the high road had failed. It was time to show them the receipts. I told Ryan I would attend the wedding. I hung up the phone and walked over to the closet where I kept my grandfather's iron safe. I was going back to the desert, but this time I was holding all the cards. The heavy iron door of the floor safe groaned as I pulled it open. The scent of old paper and dried leather wafted into my modern kitchen. I knelt on the hardwood flooring, reaching into the dark cavity. My grandfather's thick financial ledgers rested exactly where I had placed them years ago. I lifted the heavy binders out and set them on the granite island next to my open laptop. My chest felt tight. The adrenaline from the phone conversation with my brother still pumped through my veins. His voice echoed in my quiet apartment. He had sounded so convinced of his own moral superiority. He actually believed the fiction our parents spoon-fed him. He called me a runaway. He claimed I broke our mother's heart. He demanded I apologize to heal the family before his wedding. I dragged a tall stool over to the counter and sat down. For nearly 2 decades, I believed that walking away was my ultimate victory. I thought my strict silence functioned as an impenetrable boundary. Sitting there, under the bright kitchen lights, I realized my silence had been a strategic error. Taking the high road only gave Thomas and Barbara a blank canvas. They used my absence to paint themselves as tragic victims. They weaponized my quiet departure to build a pristine narrative for their friends and neighbors. I had allowed them to write my history. That ended tonight. I woke up my laptop screen and opened a web browser. I was a forensic accountant. Finding the truth hidden beneath layers of lies was what paid my mortgage. I started with the return address on the gold foil wedding invitation. The Preston family. I typed the name into a Nevada corporate database and hit the enter key. The search results cascaded down the screen, confirming everything Ryan had bragged about during his brief phone call. William Preston was a titan of commercial real estate. His holding company owned luxury resorts, sprawling golf courses, and high-rise condominiums across the Las Vegas Strip. I clicked on a link to the Preston Family Philanthropic Foundation. The screen displayed a photograph of William Preston standing next to his daughter Olivia, the bride-to-be. They were smiling perfectly at a charity gala for a children's hospital. The website detailed their extensive community outreach and their deep commitment to traditional family values. I scrolled through articles praising the Prestons for their flawless public image. They were not just wealthy, they were institutional royalty. They ran deep background checks on their business partners and guarded their reputation with ruthless precision. The puzzle pieces snapped together. The picture they formed was nauseating. Ryan was not merely marrying a wealthy woman, he was marrying an empire. An empire built on optics does not merge with a family that harbors dark, unexplained secrets. A missing sister is a huge liability, and a strange daughter who vanished at 12 years old raises uncomfortable questions during elite country club dinners. William Preston would undoubtedly ask why the groom's sister was absent from the wedding photos. Thomas and Barbara did not want me back because they missed me. They required my physical presence as a prop. They needed me to stand in the background of their photographs and smile, proving to the billionaire patriarch that the Allen family was wholesome and stable. They were inviting me to provide cover for their past sins. I opened a new tab and navigated to the county tax assessor portal. If my parents were this desperate to impress the Prestons, there had to be a deeper motivation. I typed the name of my father's logistics company into the search bar. The digital records loaded instantly, revealing a graveyard of terrible decisions. Thomas was drowning in debt. The business had 3 active tax liens filed against it within the last 14 months. Several heavy equipment loans were severely past due. The commercial warehouse was operating on fumes. My father was not just seeking social elevation through this prestigious marriage. He was seeking a financial lifeboat. He needed the Preston family wealth to save him from bankruptcy. He was banking on the fact that, once Ryan was officially married into the dynasty, William Preston would quietly bail out his new in-laws to avoid any public embarrassment. My parents were broke, and they were using my brother as their golden ticket. My cell phone vibrated on the granite counter, breaking my concentration. The screen illuminated, displaying a new text message from Ryan. It was a forwarded itinerary for the upcoming wedding weekend. I read the schedule carefully. Friday evening was designated for the rehearsal dinner at a luxury resort. Saturday morning was blocked out for something labeled as a family reconciliation brunch. Saturday evening was the formal ceremony. I stared at the words, family reconciliation brunch. The sheer arrogance of that itinerary item made my blood run cold. They had scheduled my forgiveness like a corporate team-building exercise. They planned to sit across a table covered in expensive pastries and magnanimously pardon me for crimes I never committed. They intended to play the role of the gracious, merciful parents while the Preston family watched from the sidelines. They wanted me to bow my head and accept their fake pardon and pose for the cameras. A second text message arrived from Ryan. He typed that our mother was very anxious about my attendance. He asked me to please be respectful and not cause a scene. He ended the message by stating they all just wanted to move past my childhood mistakes and start fresh. My fingers hovered over the glass screen. The urge to type out a blistering paragraph detailing the gas station, the freezing wind, and the collect call was overwhelming. But I knew Ryan would not believe me. He was thoroughly brainwashed by 17 years of their tearful performances. If I sent him the truth through a text message, he would show it to Thomas and Barbara. They would instantly deploy their practiced gaslighting. They would look at the Prestons with pitying eyes and whisper that my mental health issues had flared up again. They would spin my truth into proof of their own victimhood. I needed undeniable leverage. I needed a witness to the original sin. Financial records could prove my father was a fraud, but they could not prove he was a monster. To break the emotional stranglehold my parents had on my brother, I had to verify the origin story. I had to go back to the source. I closed my laptop and slid the text messages away. I typed a single-word reply to Ryan, confirming my attendance. I set the phone face down on the counter. I walked into my bedroom and pulled a small canvas overnight bag from the top shelf of my closet. I threw in a change of clothes, a warm sweater, and my digital voice recorder. I zipped the bag shut and slung it over my shoulder. I grabbed my car keys from the hook by the front door. The sun had already set over Reno, casting long shadows across the pavement outside my window. I was not driving toward Las Vegas yet. I had a different destination to reach first. I needed to stand on that exact patch of desolate gravel. I needed to look at the rusted metal of that garbage bin. Most importantly, I needed to see if the woman who found me shivering in the dark was still pouring coffee behind that glass counter. I locked my apartment door and walked down the steps to my car. The cool evening air filled my lungs. I started the engine and shifted the vehicle into gear. I pointed my headlights toward the barren stretch of highway leading out of the city. I was driving back into the past, but this time I was not a terrified child. I was an auditor, and I was coming to collect. The tires of my sedan chewed up the miles of dark asphalt. Leaving the city lights behind plunged me into the kind of pitch black you only find in the deep desert. I kept both hands gripped tightly on the steering wheel. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed bright green, displaying 10:15 in the evening. I was retracing a path I swore I would never drive again. Every mile marker that flashed past my headlights felt like a countdown. My mind processed the logistics of the upcoming weekend, the Preston family reconciliation brunch, the rehearsal dinner. My parents planned to use me as a human shield to protect their failing logistics company. I needed ammunition to tear that shield apart. An hour later, a faint yellow glow appeared on the horizon. The isolated gas station emerged from the darkness. It looked almost identical to my memory. The canopy over the fuel pumps had a fresh coat of white paint, but the concrete building was still the same weathered block of gray cinder. I flipped my turn signal and pulled onto the gravel shoulder. The rocks crunched loudly under my tires as I parked near the far edge of the lot. I turned off the engine and stepped out into the cold night air. The temperature was dropping rapidly, just like it had 17 years ago. I zipped up my sweater and walked toward the side of the building. I needed to see it. I rounded the brick corner and found the giant green metal trash bin. It sat in the exact same spot, creating that narrow blind alley against the wall. I stood there, looking at the stained concrete where I had shivered on a flattened cardboard box. A phantom chill ran down my spine. I did not linger in the shadows. I walked to the front of the store and pushed the glass door open. A small electronic bell chimed overhead. The interior smelled like artificial pine cleaner and roasted coffee beans. The aisles were narrow and packed with road trip snacks. I walked straight toward the checkout counter. A woman stood behind the register, wiping down the lottery ticket display with a damp cloth. She wore a faded red polo shirt and a plastic name tag. Her hair was heavily streaked with silver now, and deep lines framed her eyes, but her posture was unmistakable. It was Betty. She had to be in her late 60s. She tossed the rag under the counter and looked up, offering a polite, practiced smile. She asked if I was finding everything all right. I grabbed a small bottle of water from a nearby cooler and set it on the counter. I pulled a $20 bill from my wallet and handed it to her. "Keep the change," I said. "I just need a few minutes of your time." Betty raised a thin eyebrow, looking at the large bill and then back at my face. She asked what a young woman like me was doing out on this desolate stretch of highway so late at night. I leaned slightly closer, resting my hands on the cool laminate counter. I told her I was here 17 years ago. I explained that I was the 12-year-old girl she found freezing behind the dumpster early one morning. The practiced retail smile vanished from her face instantly. Her mouth fell open slightly. She grabbed the edge of the counter as if she needed physical support. Her eyes darted across my features, studying my jawline and my eyes. A soft gasp escaped her throat. She whispered my name. "Donna." I nodded. I told her I never got the chance to properly thank her for calling the highway patrol that morning. I said her kindness kept me alive. Betty reached across the counter and grabbed my hand. Her skin was rough and warm, her eyes filled with unshed tears. She said she had prayed for me every single week since that morning. She told me she watched the police take me away and always wondered what happened to the little girl in the oversized baseball jacket. I assured her I was safe. I explained that my grandfather took me in and raised me on his ranch. I told her I was a successful accountant, now living a good life in Reno. Her shoulders dropped in relief. She patted my hand and smiled. Then her expression shifted. The relief faded into something hard and troubled. She looked around the empty store, checking the aisles to ensure we were entirely alone. She lowered her voice to a hushed whisper. She asked if I still spoke to my parents. I shook my head. I told her I had not heard their voices since the day they drove away, until my brother called me a few hours ago. I explained they were trying to force a fake reconciliation for a high-profile wedding. Betty let go of my hand and crossed her arms over her chest. She said there was something I needed to know, something that never made it into the official police report because the local cops dismissed the case too fast. My pulse quickened. I asked her to explain. Betty took a deep breath. She said the man who worked the overnight shift back then was named Gary. Gary was a quiet guy who mostly stayed in the back office reading magazines. But Gary was thorough. After the police took me away and my parents spun their wild story about a runaway teenager, Gary felt uneasy. He did not buy their panic. So he went into the security room and rewound the surveillance tapes from the exterior cameras. I stopped breathing. I asked what Gary saw on those tapes. Betty leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. She told me the cameras captured the exact moment my father forced me out of the truck and sped away. But that was not the worst part. Gary kept watching the grainy black and white footage. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the camera facing the highway caught a pair of headlights slowing down. A red pickup truck pulled off the asphalt and rolled onto the gravel lot. It was the same truck. It did not pull up to the fuel pumps. It did not park near the front doors. The driver crept along the edge of the property, driving at a crawling pace. The truck slowly rolled past the brick wall. It stopped right in front of the green metal dumpster. Betty stared right into my eyes. She said the camera angle caught the driver rolling down his window. A man, matching my father's description, leaned his head out. He looked directly into the narrow gap between the bin and the brick wall. He stared right at the spot where I was sleeping, wrapped in that heavy jacket. He saw me. He paused there for almost a full minute. He watched his daughter shivering in the freezing dirt. He knew exactly where I was. He knew I was alive. Then, Betty said, the man rolled up his window, shifted the truck into drive, and accelerated back onto the highway, heading straight home. The floor beneath my feet felt unsteady. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights above me suddenly sounded like a roar. I had spent my entire adult life believing my parents abandoned me in a blind fit of rage. I thought their pride blinded them, and they made a snap decision to drive away, hoping I would eventually walk to a nearby farmhouse. I thought they were just cowards who panicked and covered their tracks the next morning. I was wrong. They were not cowards. They were predators. They had driven 90 miles back into the desert in the middle of the night. They located me. They looked at my freezing body huddled on a piece of cardboard, and they made a conscious, calculated decision to leave me there a second time. They drove another 90 miles back to their warm beds, comfortable with the fact that I might freeze to death before sunrise. They left me there to suffer because my existence threatened their social standing. The anger I felt in my kitchen earlier that evening was nothing compared to the cold, dark fury that bloomed in my chest right then. The revelation shifted the entire landscape of my past. This was no longer a case of childhood negligence. This was profound, unforgivable malice. Betty reached out and touched my arm again, pulling me back to the present. She asked if I was okay. Her face was etched with deep concern. I stood up straight, adjusting the strap of my canvas bag on my shoulder. The shock evaporated, leaving behind a crystal-clear focus. I was a forensic accountant. I dismantled frauds for a living. I looked at Betty and offered her a genuine smile. I told her I was more than okay. I told her she just gave me the exact piece of evidence I needed to finish an audit. I thanked her again for everything she did for me. I promised her I would put her information to good use. I walked out of the store, and the electronic bell chimed my departure. The cold wind whipped across the parking lot, tossing gravel against my boots. I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat. I closed the door, shutting out the howling desert night. The upcoming wedding in Las Vegas was no longer a family reunion. It was an execution. I was going to walk into that luxury resort, stand in front of the billionaire Preston family, and tear my parents apart, piece by piece. I reached for the ignition switch. Before my fingers could turn the key, my cell phone lit up inside the center console. The bright screen illuminated the dark cabin. The phone buzzed loudly against the plastic. I looked down at the caller identification. It was Barbara. My mother was calling me directly. The woman who looked out a truck window and left me to die was reaching out to secure her fake narrative. I stared at the glowing screen, ready to answer. The glowing green accept icon pulsed on my dashboard screen. I sat in the idling sedan, letting the incoming call ring 3 times. I wanted her to wait. I wanted the anxiety to build in her chest before I finally reached out and tapped the glass. The audio connected through the car speakers. A sharp intake of breath filled the cabin, followed by a voice I had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to forget. "Donna, sweetheart." The greeting dripped with artificial warmth. It was the exact tone she used to use when the church pastor walked past our pew on Sunday mornings. It was a voice designed to project maternal perfection to an audience. But there was no audience here. It was just the 2 of us connected by a cellular signal across a barren Nevada wasteland. I did not reply immediately. I let the silence stretch out, forcing her to carry the weight of the conversation. I learned a long time ago that silence is an interrogator's best friend. When people feel uncomfortable, they talk. When they talk, they reveal their true motives. Barbara cleared her throat. The fake warmth wavered for a fraction of a second before she doubled down. She told me how thrilled she and my father were to see my digital response. She said the entire family was just buzzing with excitement about my arrival. I stared through the windshield at the dark highway. I noted the slight tremor in her vocal cords. She was speaking a fraction too fast. A woman who is secure in her social standing speaks slowly because she knows people will wait to hear her words. My mother was rushing. She was terrified. I kept my response flat and professional. I said, "Hello, Barbara." She ignored the use of her first name. She plowed forward, steering the conversation directly toward the real reason she was calling. She started talking about the wedding venue. She named the luxury resort, dropping the 5-star rating into the sentence like a casual afterthought. She painted a picture of imported flowers, ice sculptures, and a guest list packed with local politicians. Then she shifted to the bride. She talked about Olivia Preston with a reverence bordering on worship. She made sure to casually mention that William Preston was paying for the entire weekend. She used phrases like corporate merger and dynastic alliance. She wanted me to grasp the sheer scale of the wealth involved. I listened to her brag, and my forensic brain translated her words into stark financial realities. I thought about the county tax records I had pulled up on my laptop earlier that evening. 3 active tax liens, heavy equipment loans past due, a logistics company operating on the brink of total collapse. My mother was not boasting. She was pleading. She was staring down the barrel of personal bankruptcy. Without this marriage, Thomas would lose the warehouse. Barbara would lose her house, her country club membership, and her meticulously curated social identity. They were gripping the edge of a cliff, and the Preston family fortune was the only rope in sight. She needed this wedding to execute flawlessly. She needed the billionaire in-laws to believe they were merging with a stable, respectable family. And right now, I was the only variable she could not control. Barbara lowered her voice, adopting a tone of serious confidentiality. She said, "William Preston is a very traditional man, Donna. He values loyalty and cohesion above all else. He runs deep background checks on his business partners, and he holds his family to the same standard." I asked her what that had to do with me. She let out a soft, nervous laugh. She said, "It just means we all need to put our best foot forward this weekend. We need to present a united front. Ryan deserves a perfect day without any dark clouds hanging over the celebration." The chess match entered its final phase. She was boxing me in. She was using my brother's happiness as leverage to force my compliance. Barbara took a deep breath and delivered the ultimate warning. She said, "We all know you went through a difficult phase when you were younger. We all know you have your own version of events. But this weekend is about the future. It is about building a legacy. We simply cannot afford to relitigate ancient history." Ancient history. That is what she called leaving a 12-year-old girl to freeze to death behind a garbage dumpster. A difficult phase. That is how she categorized my survival. She wanted me to agree to a gag order. She wanted me to promise that I would smile for the cameras, eat the expensive catering, and keep my mouth firmly shut. She was terrified I would sit next to a wealthy Preston aunt at the reception and casually mention the night my father drove away. I leaned back in the driver's seat. I could feel the cold leather against my spine. If I argued with her, she would label me hostile. If I demanded an apology, she would hang up and tell Ryan I was too mentally unstable to attend. The only way to guarantee my entry into that luxury resort was to give her exactly what she wanted. I had to let her believe she won the negotiation. I softened my voice. I injected a small amount of practiced compliance into my tone. I told her I understood the situation perfectly. I said I had no intention of ruining my brother's big day. I heard her exhale a long, shaky breath on the other end of the line. The relief was palpable. I promised her I would behave appropriately. I said I would follow the schedule and wear a nice dress. I assured her that no one from the Preston family would hear me complain about the past. Barbara practically beamed through the phone. Her fake maternal warmth returned full force. She called me a good girl. She said she knew I would do the right thing for the family. She told me to drive safe and said she would see me at the rehearsal dinner tomorrow evening. The call disconnected. The digital screen on my dashboard faded to black. I sat in the silence of my car and allowed a small, cold smile to touch my lips. She took the bait. She believed her manipulation tactics had worked. She thought she had successfully managed the public relations threat. She did not realize I had just agreed to a very specific set of terms. I promised not to complain about the past. I never promised to keep quiet about the present. I promised I would not ruin the wedding. I never promised I would not ruin her. I put the sedan in drive. My headlights swept across the brick wall of the gas station one last time. I pulled out onto the desert highway and turned the steering wheel south. Las Vegas was a 4-hour drive from this desolate stretch of road. I had a full tank of gas, a canvas bag in my trunk, and a manila folder waiting for me back at my apartment. Tomorrow evening, I would walk into a room filled with billionaires, politicians, and the people who threw me away. I was walking directly into the lion's den. But I was not walking in as prey. I was walking in as the hunter. The road ahead was straight and dark. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator. The engine roared as the speedometer climbed. My parents spent 17 years building a house out of cards. I was driving down there to hand them a match. The neon lights of the Las Vegas Strip sliced through the dark desert night. The glowing casinos and towering hotels replaced the barren landscape with a sprawling ocean of artificial brilliance. I navigated my sedan through the heavy evening traffic, following the digital directions toward the Starlight Pavilion. The resort was a fortress of modern luxury. Enormous glass windows reflected the city lights, and a cascading waterfall feature dominated the front drive. I pulled up to the grand entrance and shifted the car into park. A valet wearing a crisp, tailored vest opened my door immediately. I handed him my keys and stepped onto the pristine cobblestone driveway. The sheer scale of the Preston fortune was evident the moment my boots touched the polished marble floors of the main lobby. Vaulted ceilings stretched high above my head, displaying intricate gold leaf designs. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, inviting glow over guests dressed in designer evening wear. The scent of fresh lilies and expensive citrus cologne lingered in the air. A string quartet played a classical melody in the corner, providing a refined soundtrack to the quiet hum of wealthy conversations. I adjusted the strap of my simple black dress. I did not belong in this world of inherited opulence. But I was not intimidated by it either. I audited billionaires for a living. I knew that beneath the imported silk ties and the diamond necklaces, every single person in this building had a ledger filled with dirty secrets. I walked down a long corridor, following the signs pointing toward the private banquet hall reserved for the rehearsal dinner. The heavy carved oak doors stood wide open. Inside the room was packed with local elites, real estate tycoons, and powerful politicians. Waiters in white gloves glided across the patterned carpet, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes. I stepped over the threshold, scanning the crowd. Before I could even reach for a glass of sparkling water, a high-pitched theatrical shriek pierced the elegant noise of the room. "Donna! Oh, my sweet girl!" Barbara practically sprinted across the floor. She wore a sparkling silver gown that probably cost more than my entire college tuition. She threw her arms around my neck, pulling me into a suffocating embrace. The scent of her floral perfume burned the inside of my nose. She squeezed my shoulders, pressing her cheek hard against mine. She made sure her voice carried, ensuring every tycoon in a 50-foot radius turned their head to watch the touching reunion. Thomas materialized right behind her. He grabbed my elbow, squeezing the joint tight enough to send a sharp warning pulse up my arm. He pulled me into a rigid hug, patting my back loud enough for the surrounding crowd to notice. "Look who finally made it home," he boomed, using his loudest, most charismatic voice. "We missed you so much, kiddo. We are just so glad you are back where you belong." The performance was nauseating. They were actively casting me in a supporting role for their production of The Perfect American Family. To the wealthy onlookers, we looked like a beautiful picture of healing and grace. I kept my face entirely blank. I did not throw a tantrum. I did not shove them away. I let them play their parts because causing a public scene right now would only validate the troubled runaway narrative they had spent nearly 2 decades building. I stood perfectly still, collecting intelligence. Barbara grabbed my hand, dragging me toward the center of the room. She steered me directly into the path of a tall, imposing man holding a tumbler of scotch. It was William Preston. Up close, the real estate patriarch radiated immense authority. His daughter Olivia stood next to him, wearing a flawless white cocktail dress, holding onto Ryan. My older brother refused to make eye contact with me. He stared intently at the tips of his expensive leather shoes, looking like a hostage in a tailored suit. Barbara chirped her voice, trembling slightly with nervous energy. "This is our Donna. She finally decided to join us. We are just thrilled to have our little flock back together under one roof." Mr. Preston extended a manicured hand. I shook it firmly, keeping my grip strong. He assessed me with cold, calculating eyes, searching for the flaws and mental instabilities my parents had undoubtedly warned him about. He offered a polite, patronizing nod. "It is always a blessing when lost sheep find their way back to the pasture," he said, his tone heavy with judgment. I smiled thinly. "It is amazing what a long drive can clarify, Mr. Preston," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. Thomas stepped in immediately, blocking my line of sight to the billionaire. He started laughing far too loud, redirecting the conversation toward William's recent acquisition of a downtown commercial tower. I took a step back and observed the dynamic. My father practically bent in half, trying to agree with every single syllable that left Mr. Preston's mouth. Thomas nodded enthusiastically, his posture screaming sheer desperation. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. He looked less like a proud father of the groom and more like a starving beggar pleading for table scraps. The financial rot I discovered in the county tax records was leaking through his confident facade. A gentle chime echoed through the banquet hall, signaling the beginning of the meal. The guests found their assigned seats at long tables covered in fresh orchids and sterling silver cutlery. I found my name card placed strategically between Barbara and an elderly Preston aunt. They were boxing me in, keeping me under strict supervision. Waiters served courses of seared scallops and filet mignon. As the expensive wine flowed, the volume in the room increased. The elderly aunt turned toward me, adjusting her pearl necklace. She smiled kindly and asked what I did for a living up in Reno. Before I could open my mouth to answer, Barbara reached over and patted my wrist. "Donna works in a little office sorting out paperwork," she interrupted, flashing a pitying smile toward the older woman. "It is a modest job, but it keeps her busy and out of trouble. We always hoped she would find something with a bit more ambition, like her brother, but we are just grateful she is finally staying on the straight and narrow path." The aunt nodded, sympathetically sipping her dark red wine. The insult was executed with surgical precision. Barbara diminished my career, framing my specialized forensic accounting degree as a tedious clerical task. She drew a direct contrast between my supposed lack of ambition and Ryan achieving success. But Ryan had not achieved anything on his own merit. He was a high school gym teacher who happened to propose to a billionaire heiress. My mother was using my hard-earned independence as a punchline to elevate her son's unearned status. The public gaslighting was designed to suffocate any pride I held. I cut a small piece of steak and chewed it slowly. I did not defend my career. I did not list my corporate clients or explain how I tracked offshore tax evasion for multinational firms. I let Barbara bask in her smug superiority. She believed she had successfully neutralized me. She thought sitting me at a table surrounded by high society witnesses would force me into quiet submission. She failed to realize that wealth offered no protection against the truth. I spent 40 hours a week looking at the ugly realities hiding behind luxury purchases. I looked around the opulent banquet hall. I noted the anxiety radiating from my father every time the waiter refilled his glass. I saw the way my mother nervously checked her reflection in her soup spoon, ensuring her mask remained perfectly in place. They were drowning in this ocean of fortune, terrified someone would discover they did not know how to swim. Dessert arrived on gold-rimmed plates. Ryan stood up to give a brief toast, thanking the Preston family for their incredible generosity. Thomas beamed, clapping louder than anyone else in the room. He looked at William Preston with undisguised financial hunger. The motivation behind this entire charade was glaringly obvious. My parents were days away from losing their warehouse and their home. This wedding was a transaction designed to save their skins. As the dinner wound down, the guests began mingling near the private bar. Barbara leaned close to my ear, her breath smelling of expensive champagne and mints. "See how easy that was?" she whispered, her tone hardening into a sharp command. "Keep this attitude up tomorrow, and maybe we can actually have a real relationship again." I turned my head and looked directly into her eyes. I offered her a genuine smile. "I am looking forward to tomorrow, Barbara," I said. She patted my cheek and walked away to join a group of wealthy wives. I stayed in my seat, watching her work the room. They thought they had secured their fake history. They thought the worst was over. They had no idea that up in my hotel suite, sitting inside my canvas overnight bag, was a manila folder thick with forged documents and property deeds. I had gathered all the intelligence I needed from this dinner. It was time to return to my room and prepare the evidence. I rode the glass elevator up to the 12th floor, leaving the noise of the rehearsal dinner far below me. The heavy wooden doors of my hotel suite clicked shut, blocking out the synthetic casino music playing in the hallway. I kicked off my black dress shoes and walked barefoot across the plush carpet. The room was cold and silent. I preferred it that way. I walked over to the modern glass desk sitting in the corner and turned on the small brass reading lamp. I unzipped my canvas overnight bag. I reached inside and pulled out the thick leather binder I had taken from my grandfather's floor safe back in Reno. I set it down next to my laptop. My parents thought they had survived the evening. They believed their public performance downstairs neutralized any threat I posed. They did not understand that a forensic accountant does not argue in crowded banquet halls. A forensic accountant gathers data, observes the targets, and strikes when the numbers align. I opened my laptop and connected to the secure encrypted network I used for my corporate audits. I needed to answer one specific question. How did Thomas afford the opulent event I just left? I had seen the county tax records. The logistics company was drowning in unpaid debts, yet my father just hosted a dinner featuring imported seafood and top-tier champagne for a room full of real estate tycoons. That level of luxury required a sudden influx of liquid cash. I logged into the state commercial registry database. I typed my father's legal name and his business tax identification number into the search fields. I bypassed the standard credit reports and dug deeper into the secondary lending markets. Traditional banks cut off failing businesses quickly. When a man like Thomas runs out of credit, he turns to alternative lenders. The search results populated on my screen. A new public filing appeared at the very top of the list. It was dated just 6 weeks ago. I clicked the link and downloaded the digital document. It was a promissory note for a short-term bridge loan. The principal amount was staggering. It was enough money to cover the resort fees, the custom-tailored suits, and the extravagant rehearsal dinner, with plenty left over to project an image of immense wealth to the Preston family. I scrolled down to the terms of the agreement. The interest rate was predatory. It was a loan designed to trap desperate people. If the borrower defaulted, the lender possessed the right to seize the collateral immediately, without a lengthy court battle. I took a slow breath and focused my eyes on the next page. A lender issuing a high-risk loan requires bulletproof collateral. Thomas did not have any cash. His residential home was heavily mortgaged. His logistics warehouse carried 3 separate tax liens. He needed to offer the lender an asset that was free and clear of any existing debt. I found the collateral schedule listed on page 4 of the digital file. My eyes scanned the legal description of the property. The blood in my veins turned to ice. Thomas had pledged the primary Harrison Land Trust. The trust contained 300 acres of prime commercial real estate sitting right on the Nevada border. It was the most valuable asset my grandfather ever owned. The land sat directly in the path of a proposed highway expansion, making it worth millions to commercial developers. Thomas offered that exact parcel of land to the predatory lender to secure the cash for the wedding weekend. There was a fatal flaw in his plan. Thomas did not own that land. I leaned back in the ergonomic desk chair and looked at the thick leather binder sitting on the glass desk. My grandfather was a hard man, but he was not a fool. Harrison knew his son was a social climber who would eventually bankrupt himself trying to impress the local elite. 3 years before his death, Harrison called me into his study at the ranch. He handed me a sealed envelope and told me to memorize the contents. He had executed a quiet title transfer. He dissolved the original family trust and created a new private entity, naming me as the sole beneficiary and executor. He did not tell Thomas. He knew my father would throw a tantrum and demand his inheritance. Harrison wanted to ensure the land remained protected from my parents' terrible financial decisions. He handed me the deed and reminded me that desperate people will always try to rewrite the ledger. I opened the leather binder and turned to the section containing the verified property deeds. I ran my finger over the raised notary seal on the transfer document. The law was crystal clear. I owned the 300 acres. My father had zero legal claim to the property. I turned my attention back to the digital loan agreement on my laptop screen. If Thomas did not own the land, he could not use it as collateral. I scrolled down to the signature page of the promissory note. There it was, in black and white. Thomas had submitted a fraudulent statement of ownership to the lender. He claimed he was the sole executor of the Harrison estate. He fabricated a power of attorney document and forged a signature resembling mine to authorize the transaction. He committed corporate wire fraud to pay for the shrimp cocktail downstairs. The magnitude of his crime settled over me in the quiet hotel room. This was not a minor accounting error. This was a federal offense. Lying to a financial institution and forging legal documents carried mandatory prison sentences. If the predatory lender discovered the title was fraudulent, they would call the loan due immediately and file criminal charges. More importantly, if William Preston discovered his new in-laws were committing felony fraud to fake their wealth, the social alliance would disintegrate instantly. The Prestons spent decades building a pristine public reputation. They would never allow their daughter to marry into a family facing a federal indictment. My parents did not just leave a child behind at a gas station. They evolved. They became desperate criminals willing to steal their own daughter's inheritance to buy their way into a country club. They were willing to risk my financial future to secure their own status. The emotional trauma of my childhood suddenly felt distant, replaced by the cold, hard edge of material leverage. I was no longer a victim seeking an apology. I was the executioner holding the axe. I connected my laptop to the small portable printer I always carried in my work bag. I hit the print command. The machine hummed to life, spitting out crisp white pages. I printed the fraudulent loan agreement. I printed the forged power of attorney. I printed the true property deed proving my ownership of the land trust. I gathered the warm papers from the printer tray. I aligned the edges perfectly, tapping them against the glass desk. I pulled a clean manila envelope from my bag and slid the documents inside. I wrapped the string closure tight, securing the evidence. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out over the glowing Las Vegas Strip. The city below was built on illusions. Millions of people traveled here every year to pretend they were high rollers. My parents were just two more gamblers placing bets with money they did not possess. They bet their entire future on the assumption that I would stay quiet. I placed the manila envelope on the nightstand, right next to my hotel keycard. I checked the digital clock on the bedside table. It was nearly 2 in the morning. The family reconciliation brunch was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the morning. Thomas and Barbara planned to sit across a table covered in expensive pastries and offer me a fake pardon. They expected me to lower my head and accept their forgiveness while the Preston family watched. They thought they held all the power. They had no idea I was bringing a financial detonator to the breakfast table. I pulled the heavy blackout curtains closed, shutting out the neon lights. I set my alarm and lay down on the pristine white sheets. I fell asleep instantly, dreaming of the exact moment I would slide that envelope across the tablecloth. The afternoon sun dipped below the Nevada skyline, casting long shadows across the manicured courtyard. The wedding vows concluded with polite applause. A string quartet shifted their tempo, signaling the transition to the evening reception. 300 guests began moving in a slow, glamorous wave toward the grand ballroom. I walked near the back of the crowd, carrying my black leather clutch purse tightly under my arm. Inside the zippered compartment sat the manila envelope holding the fraudulent loan files and the true property deed. The air conditioning inside the resort offered a sharp contrast to the desert heat. I decided to step away from the main herd of attendees. I needed a brief moment of quiet before the dinner service commenced. I turned down a secluded side corridor lined with tall potted palms and framed oil paintings. The thick patterned carpet absorbed the sound of my heels. The hallway was entirely empty, offering a temporary reprieve from the suffocating perfume and endless small talk. A heavy hand clamped onto my upper arm, stopping my forward momentum. The grip was tight enough to pinch the fabric of my dress against my skin. I turned around quickly. Thomas stood directly behind me, blocking the path back to the main lobby. The charismatic, beaming smile he wore during the outdoor ceremony had evaporated. His facial muscles were taut and drawn, his jaw clenched tight. He darted his eyes up and down the empty corridor, ensuring no members of the Preston clan were wandering nearby. He wanted privacy. He released my arm and reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a folded legal document and a heavy silver fountain pen. He thrust them toward my chest, expecting me to reflexively grab them. I kept my hands firmly at my sides. Thomas spoke in a rushed, hushed tone. He attempted to adopt the casual voice of a busy executive managing minor details. He claimed his accountant discovered a small clerical oversight regarding the old ranch boundaries. He framed the paperwork as a standard administrative update. He said Ryan and Olivia were planning to build a vast real estate portfolio, and this routine family transfer would clean up the local tax records. He instructed me to sign the bottom line quickly so he could file it at the county clerk office on Monday morning. The lie was remarkably smooth, but it reeked of panic. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His breathing was shallow. A bead of sweat traveled down his temple, disappearing into his expensive haircut. I did not reach for the silver pen. I lowered my gaze to the crisp white paper, trembling slightly in his grip. I recognized the standard legal formatting instantly. It was an irrevocable quitclaim deed. The document contained specific language designed to surrender absolute ownership of the 300 acres my grandfather left me. Thomas was trying to retroactively legitimize the forged collateral he pledged to his predatory lender. If I applied my signature to that page, his federal wire fraud would miraculously transform into a legal authorized transaction. He needed my ink to save himself from a prison sentence. I raised my head and met his frantic stare. I told him I never sign unsolicited contracts in hotel corridors. The casual executive persona crumbled into dust. His posture shifted from a rushed businessman to a cornered animal. The polished mask slipped, revealing the ruthless, hollow core beneath his expensive tuxedo. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, using his physical height in a pathetic attempt to intimidate me. The scent of stale breath mints and aged scotch washed over my face. He lowered his voice to a venomous whisper. He dropped the pretense of a routine family transfer. He demanded I sign the paper immediately, calling me an ungrateful burden. He claimed the land rightfully belonged to him because he was the eldest son. He spat out bitter words, accusing me of stealing his inheritance through a sneaky technicality. I stood perfectly still. I watched a grown man unravel over a piece of paper. He was no longer the terrifying figure who dominated my childhood. He was just a broke, desperate fraud, terrified of losing his country club membership. When I did not flinch, his anger boiled over into outright threats. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. He reminded me that William Preston was sitting in the adjacent room, holding enough power to destroy anyone who caused a scene. Thomas warned me that if I refused to cooperate, he would summon the resort's security team. He threatened to tell the guards I was a mentally unstable stalker trying to ruin a private event. He promised to have me dragged out of the building and thrown onto the street. He leaned in so close, I could see the red veins spidering across the whites of his eyes. He said he would discard me in the gutter, just like he threw me out of the truck all those years ago. He used my deepest childhood trauma as a weapon, expecting me to crumble. He thought the mention of the highway abandonment would trigger a panic attack or force me into submissive obedience. He believed the scared 12-year-old girl still lived inside my chest. His intimidation crashed against a wall of reinforced steel. The emotional blackmail held zero currency. I did not blink. I did not step back. I looked at him with dead, hollow eyes. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of calm wash through my veins. The man standing in front of me possessed no real power. His entire existence was funded by predatory loans and forged signatures. I told him the threat of eviction meant nothing to a woman who already owned her own home. I informed him that the ranch property belonged exclusively to me, and it would never bear the Allen name. I advised him to put the silver pen away before he stained his rented suit. Thomas froze. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He expected tears. He anticipated a bitter argument. My chilling, unbothered professionalism short-circuited his entire strategy. He realized in that quiet hallway that he could no longer control my reactions. I tightened my grip on the leather clutch purse. The financial detonator rested safely inside. I stepped around his rigid frame, walking past him with measured, even strides. I did not look over my shoulder. I told him I was returning to my assigned seat for the dinner service. I left him standing alone in the secluded corridor, holding a worthless piece of paper. The private confrontation confirmed everything I suspected. My parents had not evolved. They had not learned from their past cruelty. They still viewed me solely as a disposable asset, meant to be exploited for their own gain, or a nuisance meant to be discarded when I refused to comply. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors leading into the grand ballroom. The reception space was a masterpiece of floral arrangements and crystal glassware. Waiters poured champagne into tall flutes. The Preston family sat at the head table, radiating wealth and influence. My mother sat beside them, smiling for a photographer. They were all waiting for the speeches to begin. They expected a night of touching tributes and heartwarming toasts. I walked toward my chair, navigating the maze of round tables. My pulse beat a steady, rhythmic drum in my ears. The trap was fully set. The evidence was secured. The moment of reckoning was approaching faster than a freight train, and nobody in that opulent room saw it coming. I reached my assigned chair at the edge of the dance floor. The grand ballroom buzzed with the low murmur of 300 affluent guests finishing their main courses. Waiters in tailored vests cleared away empty china plates and replaced them with crystal dessert bowls filled with chocolate mousse. I set my black leather clutch flat on the table right next to my water goblet. My fingers traced the smooth edge of the zipper. Inside that small compartment, the manila envelope waited. I kept my posture rigid. I kept my breathing even. A few moments later, Thomas emerged from the side corridor. He had recovered his composure. He smoothed the lapels of his tuxedo jacket and pasted the charismatic smile back onto his face. He walked directly to the head table and took his seat beside Barbara. My mother leaned in and whispered something in his ear. He nodded curtly. They both looked across the room, making direct eye contact with me. Their expressions were identical. They looked like two gamblers pushing their final stack of chips into the center of the table. They realized the private intimidation tactic failed, so they were shifting to the public arena. The ambient background music faded out. A sharply dressed DJ stepped onto the elevated stage, holding a wireless microphone. He tapped the metal grill twice, echoing a soft thud through the high-fidelity speakers. He asked the audience to direct their attention to the front of the room. It was time for the traditional father of the groom toast. The ballroom fell silent. The wealthy tycoons, the local politicians, and the extended Preston dynasty turned their chairs toward the head table. Thomas stood up. He buttoned his jacket and accepted the microphone from the DJ. He looked out over the sea of candle-lit faces. He looked like a man in his prime. He looked like a successful patriarch welcoming a new era of prosperity. Nobody in that crowd knew his logistics company was drowning in tax liens, or that he forged legal documents to afford the tuxedo he was currently wearing. Thomas cleared his throat and began his performance. His voice resonated through the speakers, rich and melodic. He started by thanking the Preston family for their incredible hospitality. He turned toward William Preston and offered a deep, respectful nod. He spoke about the importance of legacy. He talked about building a strong foundation for the next generation. He used corporate buzzwords disguised as sentimental advice. He called the marriage a perfect union of two strong families dedicated to preserving traditional values. William Preston raised his glass in silent approval. The billionaire patriarch appreciated the flattery. He valued men who understood the strict hierarchy of wealth. Next, Thomas turned his attention to Ryan. My brother sat next to Olivia, looking pale and exhausted. Thomas praised his athletic achievements from high school. He called Ryan the pride of their hometown. He spoke about how hard Ryan worked to become the man sitting at that table today. He painted a picture of a flawless son who never made a single mistake and always put his family first. It was a beautiful fiction. Ryan nodded, keeping his eyes focused on his half-empty champagne flute. He knew the truth, but he lacked the courage to speak it. Then the tone of the speech shifted. The triumphant energy in my father's voice softened. He lowered the microphone slightly, allowing a calculated pause to stretch across the silent ballroom. He adopted the somber tone of a man carrying a heavy emotional burden. "Every family weathers storms," he said, projecting his voice perfectly into the microphone. "Every strong tree has a few broken branches. We all face unexpected challenges that test our faith and our patience." The guests leaned forward in their chairs. They sensed the vulnerability. High society crowds loved a good redemption narrative. Thomas turned his body away from the bride and groom. He looked directly at my table. 300 pairs of eyes followed his gaze. The spotlight of the entire venue landed squarely on my shoulders. I did not blink. I kept my hands folded neatly over my leather purse. Our family is no exception, Thomas continued, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. For a long time, there was an empty chair at our dinner table. Our daughter Donna went through a very dark period. She lost her way. She drifted away from the values we tried so hard to instill in her. She made choices that broke her mother's heart. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. The Preston relatives exchanged sympathetic glances. Barbara dabbed the corner of her eye with a white linen napkin, playing the role of the long-suffering mother to perfection. They were painting me as the prodigal daughter. They were cementing the runaway teenager lie into the official public record right in front of the most powerful people in the state. Thomas took a step closer to the edge of the stage. He held his free hand out toward me with his palm facing upward. It was a gesture of supreme magnanimity. "But we are not here to dwell on the mistakes of the past," he announced, his voice rising in volume. "We are here to celebrate the future. We are here to celebrate healing and unity. Donna, I want you to know how proud we are that you finally decided to come back to us. We know it took courage to face us after everything you did." He paused, letting the heavy silence amplify his next words. "But tonight, our family is whole again. Donna, we forgive you for the past. Welcome home." He raised his crystal champagne flute high into the air. The manipulation was a masterpiece. It was the ultimate trap. Thomas had just publicly pardoned me for crimes I never committed. He weaponized the social etiquette of 300 high society guests. He knew the unspoken rules of this environment. In a room full of billionaires, you do not cause a scene. You do not shout. You do not argue with a crying father giving a wedding toast. You smile, you lower your head, and you accept the grace being offered to keep the peace. The ballroom erupted in applause. The sound was deafening. Guests at the surrounding tables turned toward me, clapping politely. A few older women smiled warmly, offering encouraging nods. They expected me to break down. They waited for the tears of relief to fall. They anticipated me standing up to walk across the room and hug the man who just granted me absolution. Thomas kept his glass raised. He stared at me through the sea of clapping hands. His eyes were cold and victorious. He thought he checkmated me. If I stayed silent, I validated his lie. I would officially become the forgiven runaway. If I threw a fit, I would look like a deranged, ungrateful child, proving his narrative correct to the Prestons. He believed he backed me into an inescapable corner. The tension in the air grew thick and heavy. The applause continued, stretching on for several agonizing seconds. Barbara smiled, wiping another fake tear from her cheek. William Preston nodded, looking satisfied that the messy family business was officially resolved and tucked neatly away. I sat in my chair, surrounded by the deafening noise. I felt the smooth leather of my clutch beneath my fingertips. My parents played their final aggressive hand. They tried to bury the truth under a wave of high society champagne clinking. They expected me to surrender to the peer pressure. They expected me to shrink to fit the role they assigned me all those years ago. I did not cry. I did not stand up to hug him. I unzipped the main compartment of my purse and slipped my fingers around the thick edge of the manila envelope. The room was waiting for a reaction. I was ready to give them one. The applause swelled around me, echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the enormous venue. Hundreds of manicured hands clapped in unison, validating the performance my father just delivered. Thomas stood on the stage, bathing in the adoration. He kept his crystal flute raised, soaking in the sound of his own victory. I kept my hand inside my purse, feeling the rough paper of the envelope. I prepared to stand up and break his illusion, but before my muscles could push me out of my chair, a harsh, grating sound cut through the noise. It was the sound of heavy wooden chair legs dragging across the polished dance floor. The noise originated from the sweetheart table. Ryan was on his feet. My older brother looked nothing like the confident groom who said his vows earlier that afternoon. His face was devoid of color. The pristine white collar of his tuxedo shirt seemed too tight around his neck. He stood frozen for a fraction of a second, staring out at the sea of clapping guests. For 17 years, he had swallowed the lies our parents fed him. He had accepted their narrative because it was easier than confronting the ugly reality of his childhood home. But seeing Thomas publicly humiliate me while demanding gratitude had finally cracked his conditioning. Ryan looked down at his new bride. Olivia sat holding her champagne glass, gazing up at her husband. They exchanged a silent look. It was a communication built on whatever private conversations they shared before this day. Olivia gave him a single, firm nod. Ryan stepped away from his table. He walked directly toward the stage, where our father stood. Thomas noticed him approaching. The patriarch smiled even wider, assuming his son was coming to embrace him to create the perfect photo opportunity for the hired cameramen. Thomas lowered his glass and opened his free arm, ready to accept the hug. He leaned forward, projecting paternal warmth. Ryan did not open his arms. He did not smile. He walked straight up to Thomas and reached out. Instead of embracing his father, Ryan closed his hand around the wireless microphone. Thomas blinked in confusion. His grip tightened on the device for a split second, refusing to let go. Ryan locked eyes with him and pulled harder. The physical tug-of-war lasted only a moment, but it spoke volumes. Thomas released the microphone. The sudden transfer of the device sent a wave of unease through the head table. Barbara sat up straighter. Her practiced maternal smile faltered, exposing the tight lines of panic around her mouth. She reached out and grabbed the edge of the tablecloth, her knuckles turning white. William Preston narrowed his eyes. The billionaire patriarch possessed a sixth sense for social disruptions. He recognized a deviation from the schedule. He set his drink down on the table, crossing his arms over his chest. The polite applause in the ballroom began to die down. Guests noticed the tension radiating from the stage. The clapping scattered into an awkward, uneven rhythm before fading out entirely. A thick, uncomfortable silence replaced the celebratory noise. Ryan turned his back on our parents. He descended the 3 carpeted steps leading off the stage. He did not look at the Preston family. He did not look at the wealthy tycoons or the local politicians sitting at the front tables. He walked directly toward the back of the room. The guests, sitting in his path, shifted in their chairs, turning their bodies to follow his movement. The silence in the ballroom grew heavier with each step he took. The only sound was the soft thud of his dress shoes against the carpet. He navigated the narrow spaces between the round tables, ignoring the confused whispers rippling through the crowd. He was crossing a physical divide, but he was also crossing a psychological boundary. He was leaving the safety of the facade and stepping into the harsh light of reality. He stopped walking when he reached my table. He stood, towering over me. His chest rose and fell with rapid breaths. His eyes were red-rimmed and glassy. He looked at me, not as a troubled runaway, but as a sister who had survived a nightmare he refused to acknowledge until today. He lifted the microphone to his mouth. His voice echoed through the venue, carrying none of the smooth charisma our father used. It was raw and unsteady. "My sister came a long way to be here tonight," he said. The words hung in the air. He did not elaborate on the geography or the emotional distance. He just stated a simple fact. "I think she should say a few words as my family," Ryan announced. The ballroom went dead silent. The air felt thin and electric. A collective gasp rippled from the head table. Barbara jumped to her feet, her chair tipping backward and hitting the floor with a loud thud. Thomas scrambled down the stage steps, his face flushed dark red. He extended a hand toward Ryan, opening his mouth to issue a command, but no words came out. The panic in his eyes was vivid and raw. He realized he had lost control of the narrative. He could not order security to drag the groom away from his own wedding reception. He could not silence his own son without looking like a tyrant in front of his new billionaire in-laws. Thomas turned his head frantically toward the DJ booth, located in the corner of the room. He waved his hand horizontally across his throat, signaling the sound technician to cut the audio feed. The DJ looked confused. He held his hand over the mixing board, unsure whether to follow the frantic father or the groom. William Preston noticed the desperate hand gesture. The billionaire shifted his gaze from Thomas to the DJ, offering a subtle shake of his head. The DJ dropped his hand, leaving the audio feed live. The patriarch of the Preston family wanted to hear what was about to happen. Ryan had just granted me the ultimate platform. He chose the ugly truth over the pristine aesthetic of the country club. I looked at my brother. I saw the apology in his posture. I saw the desperate need for the truth. He was handing me the weapon and stepping out of the line of fire. I unzipped my leather clutch the rest of the way. I slid my fingers inside and gripped the edge of the thick manila envelope. The rough texture of the paper grounded me. I pulled it out and set it flat on the pristine white tablecloth. I pushed my chair back, letting it scrape against the floor. I stood up, smoothing the front of my black dress. I reached out and took the microphone from his hand. The plastic handle was warm from his grip. Ryan took a step back, giving me the floor. I stood at the edge of the dance floor, holding the audio feed for 300 expectant guests. I looked past the rows of centerpieces and the glowing candles. I locked eyes with my father, who was frozen halfway between the stage and my table. His chest heaved. He looked at the manila envelope resting next to my water glass. He did not know what documents were inside, but he knew his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. I raised the microphone. I did not feel any anger. I did not feel any sadness. I felt the cold, precise focus of an auditor ready to present the final numbers. The room waited for me to speak. I brought the black plastic microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the high-definition speakers, wrapping around the crystal chandeliers and sinking into the velvet drapes. I did not raise my pitch. I did not let my hands tremble. I spoke with the terrifying, even cadence of a judge reading a final verdict. "Good evening," I said, looking directly at the head table. "My name is Donna Allen. You were just told that I was a troubled teenager who ran away from home and broke my mother's heart. You were told that I drifted away from traditional values and required forgiveness. That is a very beautiful story. It is also a carefully constructed lie designed to hide a crime." A low murmur rolled through the banquet hall. I kept my eyes locked on William Preston. The billionaire patriarch sat rigid, his sharp gaze piercing through the candlelight. I addressed him directly, bypassing the tycoons and local politicians sitting in the front rows. "Mr. Preston, you value loyalty and truth. You run rigorous background checks on your business partners because you demand integrity from the people sitting at your table. I am a forensic accountant. I uncover hidden liabilities and dismantle financial frauds for a living. Tonight, I am going to audit the family your daughter just married into." Barbara let out a high-pitched gasp. She lunged forward, trying to grab the edge of the tablecloth to push herself up. Thomas slammed his hand down on her wrist, forcing her to stay seated. His knuckles turned white from the force of his grip. He knew any physical outburst would only validate my position. He stared at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered dread. The confident executive persona he wore 5 minutes ago melted away, leaving behind a terrified, desperate man. I turned my attention to the center of the room, ensuring every guest heard my next words. 17 years ago, I did not run away. I was 12 years old. My father drove me 90 miles into the Nevada desert after a dinner very similar to this one. I had embarrassed him in front of his wealthy friends by mentioning our late mortgage payments. He pulled into a desolate gas station, surrounded by miles of empty scrub brush. He ordered me out of his vehicle. He looked me in the eye and told me to grow up and figure out how to get home. Then he shifted his truck into drive, spun his tires on the gravel, and left me standing in the dirt. The silence in the grand ballroom turned suffocating. Several guests stopped breathing. An older woman near the front row covered her mouth with a trembling hand. A man sitting to my left slowly lowered his fork to his plate, refusing to chew his food. I continued delivering the facts with surgical precision. I found a payphone bolted to a brick wall. I called my house collect, hoping it was all just a terrible joke. My father answered the phone. The operator asked if he would accept the charges. My father told the operator that I needed to learn a lesson. He hung up on a freezing 12-year-old girl. I spent that night curled inside a flattened cardboard box behind a grease-stained dumpster, wearing my brother's oversized baseball jacket. I counted semi-truck headlights to stay awake, while the temperature dropped toward freezing. William Preston shifted his weight. He looked at Thomas. The patriarch of the Preston family did not tolerate child abuse. The disgust settling over his weathered features was undeniable. He uncrossed his legs and leaned back, placing a clear physical distance between himself and my father. "But that is not the worst part," I said, lowering my voice, forcing the crowd to lean in to hear the rest. Later that night, a gas station security camera recorded a red pickup truck pulling back into that lot. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. My parents drove 90 miles back into the desert. They rolled past the fuel pumps at a crawling pace. They looked into the shadows and saw me shivering on the concrete. They saw I was alive, and they made the conscious, calculated decision to abandon me a second time. They drove another 90 miles home and went to sleep. The horror rippling through the wealthy audience was palpable. Silver forks clattered against china plates. People stared at the head table with open revulsion. The pristine public image Thomas and Barbara spent 2 decades building shattered into microscopic fragments. They were no longer respectable pillars of the community. They were monsters sitting under a spotlight. "But emotional cruelty is not a crime," I stated, shifting my posture. "I am not standing here to demand an apology for a childhood injury. I did not RSVP to this wedding to heal. I came here today because the same man who left his daughter to freeze to death is currently trying to steal her inheritance to pay for your dinner." I reached into my black leather clutch. I gripped the manila envelope and pulled it out. I held the thick paper up for the entire room to see. I untwisted the string closure and slid the documents into my hand. Thomas lost all remaining color in his face. His jaw went slack. His eyes widened in absolute terror. He recognized the heavy legal paper. He recognized the blue ink of the notary stamp visible on the top page. He knew exactly what I was holding. I looked at Mr. Preston again, maintaining unbreakable eye contact. "Your new in-laws are drowning in debt," I said. "My father's logistics company has 3 active tax liens. He is on the verge of total bankruptcy. He needed a massive influx of cash to afford this luxury resort. These tailored tuxedos and the imported champagne you are currently drinking. He needed to prove to you that he belonged in your tax bracket, hoping you would quietly bail him out after the wedding rings were exchanged." I stepped off the dance floor and walked slowly toward the head table. The crowd parted instinctively, granting me a clear path. Nobody tried to stop me. Not even the resort security guards standing near the walls made a move. To secure the cash for this extravagant weekend, my father took out a predatory bridge loan, I explained, my voice carrying across the silent room. A loan like that requires pristine collateral. He pledged 300 acres of prime commercial real estate near the state border. There is only one problem. My father does not own that land. My grandfather transferred that entire estate to me before he died. He knew his son was a fraud. I stopped right in front of Thomas. He was sweating profusely. The expensive fabric of his shirt clung to his damp skin. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. He looked like a cornered rat trapped in a cage of his own design. Barbara sat frozen, her face buried in her hands, weeping into her napkin. I held up the first document. This is the true property deed proving I am the sole owner of the Harrison Land Trust. I held up the second document. This is the promissory note my father signed 6 weeks ago. In order to secure this loan, he fabricated a power of attorney. He forged my signature on a federal financial document. He committed corporate wire fraud to buy his way into your family. I tossed the papers onto the table. They landed right next to his half-empty champagne flute. The heavy sheets of paper slapped against the white linen, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet venue. The destruction was instantaneous and absolute. William Preston stood up from his chair. The billionaire patriarch did not say a single word to my parents. He did not yell or cause a scene. He simply looked at the forged documents resting on the tablecloth. He looked at Thomas with an expression of pure, icy contempt. Preston reached out and gently placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. Olivia was crying quietly, staring at her new husband in shock. Ryan stood a few feet away, looking completely broken, but finally free from the lies. Mr. Preston turned his back on the Allen family. He signaled to his personal security detail standing near the exit doors. The message was universally understood. The dynastic alliance was terminated. The financial bailout my parents desperately needed would never happen. Any social standing they possessed in the state of Nevada evaporated the moment those papers hit the table. Thomas sat paralyzed. He stared at the forged documents, knowing his life was over. He knew the predatory lender would audit the file by Monday morning, once the rumors of this dinner spread. He knew the police would arrive shortly after. He was facing a mandatory federal prison sentence. He had wagered his freedom and his legacy on the assumption that a scared little girl would stay quiet. He forgot that the little girl grew up and learned how to read the ledger. I looked down at the man who threw me away. He had nothing left. No money, no reputation, no family. I did not gloat. I did not offer any final dramatic insults. I simply turned around and walked away from the wreckage. I navigated through the stunned crowd of tycoons and politicians. They watched me pass with silent respect, yielding the floor to the woman who just executed the most flawless audit in the history of Las Vegas. I walked away from the head table, leaving the forged documents resting next to the crystal champagne flutes. My heels clicked against the polished hardwood of the dance floor. The stunned tycoons and politicians parted like water, allowing me to pass. For a few seconds, the grand ballroom remained entirely silent. Then, the paralysis behind me broke. Thomas shattered the quiet. He slammed his hands against the table, causing the silverware to rattle and a water glass to topple over. He shouted my name. His voice cracked, lacking all the smooth charisma he possessed during his toast. He pointed a shaking finger at my back. He yelled to the crowd that I was a bitter liar. He claimed I fabricated the property deeds to ruin his reputation. He desperately tried to salvage his crumbling facade by spinning one final, desperate narrative. He stepped around the table, intending to chase me down. He did not make it far. The Preston family security detail moved with rapid precision. 2 men, wearing dark tailored suits, intercepted my father before he could cross the carpet. They did not draw weapons, but their physical presence was an impenetrable wall. They placed their large hands firmly against his chest, stopping his forward momentum instantly. William Preston remained standing. The billionaire patriarch looked at the frantic, sweating man struggling against the security guards. Preston did not raise his voice. He did not need volume to project ultimate authority. He spoke in a low, measured tone that carried across the silent room. He told Thomas to gather his wife and exit the building. Preston stated clearly that his holding company and his family do not associate with criminals. He instructed his guards to escort the Allens off the resort property immediately. He added that his personal legal team would be contacting the authorities regarding the forged documents left on the table. The social execution was swift and absolute. Thomas stopped struggling. The fight drained out of his posture. He slumped forward, realizing no amount of charm or manipulation could fix the damage. The wealthy investors he spent years trying to impress were currently staring at him with open disgust. Barbara did not try to defend him. Her knees buckled. She dropped heavily into a velvet dining chair. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly. There were no fake tears this time. She wept for the loss of her country club membership. She mourned the death of her pristine public image. The legacy she valued above her own daughter was permanently ruined. I reached the back of the ballroom near the massive oak exit doors. I paused next to a tall cocktail table. I opened my black leather clutch one final time. I reached inside and pulled out the crisp white paper Thomas handed me in the secluded hallway earlier that evening. It was the blank quitclaim deed he tried to force me to sign. I placed the unsigned document face up on the glass tabletop. It was a visual receipt of his failure. I turned my back on the chaos, pushed the heavy brass handles, and walked out of the banquet hall. The lobby was cool and quiet. The string quartet had stopped playing. I walked toward the front entrance, feeling the immense weight of the past 2 decades lift from my shoulders. The air felt lighter. I took a deep breath of the air-conditioned breeze. Footsteps echoed against the marble floor behind me. The sound was rushed and heavy. I stopped walking and turned around. Ryan jogged down the corridor. He had discarded his suit jacket and ripped the silk bow tie away from his collar. Olivia walked right beside him, holding the hem of her white wedding dress to keep it from dragging on the floor. They bypassed the security guards. They walked right past the room where Thomas and Barbara were currently being escorted out by force. Ryan stopped a few feet away from me. He looked exhausted, but the heavy burden of our parents' lies no longer clouded his eyes. For his entire life, he played the role of the golden child. He accepted the fake history because it was comfortable. But tonight, he chose the ugly truth over the aesthetic of a perfect family. He looked at me and swallowed hard. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not ask me to come back inside and fix the mess. He simply said he was sorry he believed their story for so long. Olivia stepped forward and gently linked her arm through his. She looked at me with profound respect. She told me they were leaving the resort. They were abandoning the opulent reception Thomas and Barbara orchestrated. They refused to celebrate their marriage under a cloud of fraud and manipulation. I nodded. We did not share a dramatic embrace. The healing would take time, but the foundation was finally real. The 3 of us walked out the front doors of the luxury hotel together. We proved that truth and accountability form the basis of a real family, not blind blood obligation. I drove back to Nevada that night. I returned to my quiet apartment and resumed my life. The fallout in my hometown happened rapidly over the next 3 weeks. The alternative lender audited the loan file the very next Monday. When they discovered the forged power of attorney and the fake collateral, they executed their penalty clauses instantly. They called the massive loan due in full. Thomas did not possess the liquid cash to pay them back. The lender seized the logistics warehouse and liquidated the trucks. The business defaulted and collapsed within 14 days. The financial ruin was only the beginning. The federal authorities opened a formal inquiry into the wire fraud. Investigators began knocking on doors, interviewing the bank tellers and the notary public whose stamp Thomas falsified. The local elite who witnessed the reception disaster severed all ties. Thomas and Barbara were expelled from their country club. Their friends stopped returning their phone calls. They became social pariahs in the town they once sought to rule. My cell phone rang constantly during those first few weeks. The caller identification displayed blocked numbers and unfamiliar local lines. My parents were using burner phones to bypass my blocks. I never answered a single call. I let every ring go straight to my digital voicemail. Sometimes I listened to the first 10 seconds of the audio recordings just to verify the caller. Barbara left frantic, weeping messages. She begged me to transfer a small portion of the ranch land to help them pay their mounting legal fees. She pleaded with me to drop the fraud allegations, claiming they were facing prison time. Thomas left angry, demanding voicemails that quickly devolved into pathetic bargaining. He offered to publicly apologize if I just signed the quitclaim deed. I deleted every single message. I did not text them back. I did not gloat. I simply maintained the impenetrable boundary I built when I was 12 years old. They spent 17 years ignoring my absence. Now they could spend the rest of their lives dealing with it. I spent a Saturday afternoon driving out to the 300 acres of rural property my grandfather left me. I parked my car near the wooden fence and walked across the dry Nevada dirt. The wind blew through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of dry earth and freedom. I looked out over the vast expanse of land. I protected the assets Harrison worked his entire life to build. I kept the properties safe from the hands of a man who viewed everything and everyone as a disposable commodity. I reclaimed my personal history. I forced the people who threw me away to stand in front of their peers and face the exact reality they tried to bury. I did not have to shout or throw a tantrum to achieve justice. I just handed the world the ledger and let the math do the talking. If you are currently sitting at a dinner table where your worth is measured by your compliance, it is time to push your chair back. When toxic relatives demand you play a supporting role in their fake narrative, you do not have to argue with them. You do not have to fight for a seat you never wanted in the first place. The most devastating revenge you can ever achieve is simply handing them the truth and walking away. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own future, type the word truth in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Grape Vengeance for more stories about setting boundaries and finding your own way home. I will see you in the next video.